Welcome to FY028 Inquiry Based Learning. This is week 9, and this week we're looking at how to write in a critical way. So what is critical writing? So the most characteristic features of any critical writing are a clear and confident refusal to accept the conclusions of other writers without evaluating the arguments and evidence that they provide. So really, being critical and being a critical writer means that you are critical about the things that you are reading before you start writing. So when you're reading arguments presented by other academics and other academic papers that you're reading, you should be critical about them and look at the arguments that they're making and again, take a critical approach. Refuse to accept conclusions until you actually have a body of evidence or proof from other supporting articles that you've read. A balanced presentation of reasons why the conclusions of other writers may be accepted or may need to be treated with caution. So after you've read around what one writer has written and you've read other sources on a similar topic, hopefully to confer that what they've written is correct or at least plausible, then when you're thinking about the presentation of those conclusions, you need to also cite the other sources that you've been looking at. So this is the absolute core of academic writing. You don't just take things on face value. You write down what somebody says, but then you provide evidence and conclusions as to why what they've said may be plausible or not. And you essentially discuss what they're saying in a way that brings in other sources that you've looked at and read around. So no one source should be used on its own in isolation, essentially. So if you're just putting down one source and saying, writer X says this, that sounds all right to me, then that's not the correct way of doing it. Because if you're just putting down one source and saying, I've read this one source and I believe what they say, there's no criticality to your writing. You're not actually discussing anything. You're just simply presenting something as fact, which may actually be not fact, or maybe just one perspective. You need to try to always create a little argument, create a little discussion, which brings in other writers and says, well, this is what X writer says, and this is what Y writer says, this is why W writer says, and all three writers are writing around the same topic area, and maybe they're all agreeing with each other. But at that point, you've been quite critical about it, and you've got three different points of view, different perspectives. But maybe the conclusion is they're agreeing broadly on this particular subject area, and that's actually quite exciting. I think that lifts academic writing when you start to do that. So when you think critically about it, you're actually determining something based on multiple perspectives and multiple things that you've looked at. Now add to that a clear presentation of your own evidence and argument leading to your conclusion, and a recognition of your limitations in your own evidence and argument and the conclusions you make. So surrounding the use of multiple sources to back up and support a point that you want to make, you obviously need to balance in your own argument and your own conclusions based on what evidence you found. So, if you've used 3 sources, then that's just 3 sources. If you'd used 10 different articles, obviously that's probably more balance, more of a perspective has been shown, more argument has come into that, the conclusions are probably firmer. So we always try to, in our writing, determine and show how conclusive we think it is. So when we make an argument in writing, if we use a number of sources, that might be fine. That's sort of critical approach. But at the same time, if we've only used a couple of sources, then our conclusions that we can draw from that might have to be fairly speculative, because clearly we haven't necessarily looked at a broader range of sources. We haven't got more than just a few, or maybe our access to other sources is limited in some other way, and we have to put that down. So really, it's just about trying to explain why your conclusions that you've drawn from what you're presenting are not necessarily the firmest conclusions that you could possibly have, based on the evidence that you've been able to source and the limitations of accessing that evidence. So you need to be very careful in making any statements or conclusions based on perhaps a limited number of sources and the arguments that you've been able to make, the limited arguments you've been able to make around what you've been looking at. So this is the art of critical writing. So if you're just presenting, as I said, a single statement and saying that's the statement, that must be true, and moving on, then you've got no critical factors there. So you've got no criticality in the sense that you haven't compared it to other sources, you haven't argued around it, you haven't suggested that having just one source of information is a limitation. You haven't got anything to base your own arguments and evidence around. So that would be very poor. So the more sources you can add, the more you can build up the argument, and also the acknowledgement that you give to the argument's limitations and weaknesses, that also supports you as a critical writer, because you're saying, well, I'm not really totally sure, this isn't something I can be absolutely certain of, but I have a certain amount of probability against it based on the fact that I've used these sources, they're trusted in various ways. So what then is descriptive writing? So the most characteristic features of descriptive writing are that it will describe something but will not go beyond an account of what appears to be there. So a certain amount of descriptive writing is needed to establish certain things. For example, the setting of the research, the general description of a piece of literature or art, the list of measurements taken, the timing of the research, and account the biographical details of the key figure within your field or discipline, or a brief summary of the history leading up to an event or decision. So yes, so there's going to be certain amounts of descriptive writing within any report. So it's not that everything has to be critical in the sense of everything has to be weighted and multiple sources used and so on. But sometimes you will just want to describe, using descriptive writing, what's actually happened, to give you that kind of background setting. So the history, for example, is something, or the summary of the history is fine to sort of summarize that within your own descriptive sort of terms. So yeah, so these are things where if you're doing a list of measurements or describing something generally, then descriptive writing is still absolutely applicable. But it's just knowing when to be critical and when to be descriptive. So descriptive writing then versus critical writing. So with descriptive writing, you're not really developing any arguments or discussions. You're simply setting the background within the argument that can be then developed on in the critical part. So you're representing the situation as it stands without presenting any analysis or further discussion onto it. And descriptive writing is relatively simple writing. There's also the trap that it can be easy to use many words from your word limit, simply providing description. So in terms of descriptive writing, there's going to be some descriptive writing in your report, but what you don't want to do is end up writing lots of descriptive writing and very little critical writing. So in terms of the balance, you want more critical writing than you want descriptive, but descriptive will be there to support it. So in providing only description, you are presenting but not transforming information. You're reporting ideas but not taking them forward in any significant way. Okay, so you're not presenting any arguments that present information in anything other than as it is. So in critical writing, you are trying to transform the statements of others and sources you've read and things you've been looking at in terms of turning them into an argument and a discussion on the page. But in descriptive writing, you're just explaining things in a very straight, simple way. So an assignment only using descriptive writing would therefore, wouldn't gain really any marks. It's very limited in its marking potential because it just describes things as is. And that's not what we're trying to get from you in this report. We're trying to understand how you think and how you've thought about the area you've been looking at, the topic you've been discussing, the research you've been doing, trying to assess how you've been transformed and informed by the writing and reading that you've been doing. So critical writing is absolutely key for that, because if you can write critically, if you can discuss and build an argument, develop things around sources you've been looking at, the materials you've been engaging with, the information you've been manipulating in terms of putting it into the report and picking and choosing, selecting what you want to present, that is really dynamic, and it's really at the heart of the research approach. So that will gain you lots more marks, really, at the end of the day. Critical writing is what we want to see, but there will be some description in there as well. We can't do one or t'other totally. So with critical writing, you're really participating in what we'd consider to be an academic debate. And you might find that a bit odd. If you say debate, there's only yourself and your books, but you're debating with the books really and the sources you're using. So by finding those sources, those articles, those textbooks, those parts of documentation, that's information, you're engaging in a debate with the writers of those reports, pages, articles, and you're trying to build up your own conclusions from that. So it's much more sort of challenging, slightly risky, I suppose. There's a risk element that you might draw odd conclusions from it, or conclusions which are not founded really, just based on the evidence you've kind of come across. So you need to weigh up the evidence and arguments of others, and contribute something of your own into it. So it is a dynamic process. Hopefully the risk is reduced if you are using multiple sources and backing everything up from multiple perspectives. So the more perspectives you have on a particular topic or area, the more chances are that you're not going to be on such risky ground. So things get more and more dodgy, the less conclusive, I should say, rather than dodgy, but less conclusive when you are only having limited number of sources or only one source. That's kind of fatal. So the more sources you have, looking at different things, different perspectives, building up an argument, building up a discussion, the better your writing will be. So you need to really consider the quality of the evidence and argument that you have read. So in your reading around the subject area, looking at articles, so that's why I'm pushing you to use the academic databases. So I want you to really use library materials, not just general stuff that you're finding on the internet. Stuff that actually comes from good academic sources and good pedigree in those sources, because that gives you really good quality. And the good thing about good quality is it means that you have good evidence and you have a good argument from that quality material. You need to identify key positive and negative aspects you can comment upon. So it's quite useful actually if you've got writers from different sources that are arguing about a particular point, or they slightly conflict, or maybe one writer sees something in a particularly positive way and one sees it in a slightly negative way. That's quite good, because that means that gives you scope for your own comment. So if somebody's, if you've got 2 or 3 writers and they're arguing about something, or not arguing in a combative way, it might be quite subtle, especially in our sort of subject and computing areas. We there tends to be sort of fair common agreement on lots of things, but there might be a different approach or different techniques or a different way to see something, and that's what you might be picking up on. And when you're looking at those different approaches and techniques and the way the different writers in different articles are talking about maybe the same sort of subject area, that's where you can inject your own commentary. That's where you can talk about yourself, your own thoughts and feelings on that. So if you've got writers that go sort of more positive about something and someone slightly wary or negative about something, you might choose which side of the argument you want to stand on, and you can put some of yourself in there. So it's not all about what others are writing necessarily. You just have to make sure that when you put yourself into it, when you're writing some of your own commentary within there, that it's based upon arguments that have been made by these sources, and you're just joining on one particular side. So you also need to assess the relevance of the papers and articles you're using, and the usefulness to the debate that you're engaging in for your assignment, the work, the report you're working on. So again, that always really key with critical stuff. There's no point putting arguments together which are essentially irrelevant or don't really add anything to the report. So if you have something that's outside the topic area or not relevant to it, or has a very tenuous link, then it's probably best to just kind of remove that altogether. So you need to pick and choose always what you're engaging with, how you're developing it, and you also need to identify how best they can be woven into the argument that you are developing. So I think I've talked about this in the past in other presentations for this module, where I say about bringing parts of your writing together that don't really make sense, or there's no logic to their flow, or they're very out of step with each other. So if you're just trying to make argument for argument's sake by finding articles that are kind of generally linked but not very well, and you're just trying to make an argument out of these things for the sake of it, then obviously that's not really going to weave together within the whole piece. So the whole report has to hang together based on logical, sound arguments that are being made relative to, and useful to the argument you're trying to put together in that text. So it's really important they weave, and the whole report sort of flows as one all the way through for the reader. If it's very disjointed and arguments are just being made for the sake of arguments, then you're going to kind of get this very jerky effect where you're reading one bit and then suddenly you're jerked out of that, and you're reading something else and then you're jerked out of that and you're reading another argument. That's not going to make a very good report. So just be very careful about how you kind of thread these arguments together and have some linking, common linkage between them, and have some development of the end of one argument and the beginning of the next, so they flow into each other in a sensible way, so the reader doesn't feel like you've just come out of one argument that was a bit sort of random into another random argument. Make sure there's some commonality, and there's some logical progression, and there's some linking that's been done between the end of one sentence, one discussion and the next. So the thing about critical writing is, other than descriptive writing, it does take a higher level of skill, as you can probably tell. There's going to be much more work involved in trying to find all these sources and write an argument based on multiple perspectives and multiple sources that you're using. And of course, that's, we will reward that with higher marks. So the more effort and work that you put in to find multiple authors, multiple articles, multiple points of view, and build a critical argument from that and discussion within your work, the more you get rewarded in the marks. And that's really it, really. So your reward is better marks overall. So if you're not getting better marks, if you don't get the marks that are high marks on this particular assignment, then it suggests you really need to work on your critical writing, because critical writing is paramount to any academic approach, especially in higher education. So this may be, again, one of those watershed moments between further education and higher education, in that perhaps in further education they're more interested in sort of descriptive writing, whereas in higher education we are fixated on critical writing and your ability to analyse and build an argument and discuss and weave things together in a much deeper way and a much critical way, which just take a little bit more skill and work and effort to do that. And of course that's part and parcel of your move up the educational hierarchy. So finding your academic voice then. So when you engage in critical writing, you're essentially developing your own academic voice within your subject area. So this is the exciting thing about critical writing, is that it really engages you in the process of being critical and argumentative around what you're reading from other academic writers and so on. So, naturally you start to develop your own perspective, your own voice, your own thinking on an area. So the thing about what is an academic voice then, what should you have? Well, hopefully you should develop this kind of healthy skepticism, but it's not cynicism. So you're not always, just dismissing everything. It's just skepticism. It just means that, you read something and you go, I tend to use the phrase, "Oh, that's interesting." And by interesting, I mean, I'll wait until I've heard some other arguments to the same thing from other sources before I, make a judgment on it. And that's not cynicism. That's just simply part and parcel of me as an academic going, well, I've read this, but just because I read it in one article and it sounds very good and I was interested in what I wrote, what the writer's written here, I still want to kind of find out whether that's quite right or not. And I want to see some other writers writing about the same subject before I kind of make up my mind and decide which of the argument side I'm going to kind of join if there's a difference of opinion or so on. So, it's just that kind of healthy curiosity, skepticism about what you are reading, that it may not be, don't take things at face value, really. Just assume, well, I need to do a bit more. I also might say, I need to do a bit more further research. And, we live our lives by research in academia. We're always trying to find out more so that we can build up a better picture and argument and develop some reasoning which suggests, which way to go. So we have a certain amount of confidence in our approach, and I've put it's not cockiness or arrogance there. Although some academics, I have to say, especially ones that are perhaps on the stage a lot, they sometimes come across in a bit of an arrogant way. But about subject areas they know well. But the idea is not to be. You're confident in the subjects you've been looking at because you spent many hours and weeks and days building up your critical writing on a subject area. So the more involved you get in a subject, the more confidence you'll have with it. So judgment which is critical but not dismissive. So you have to be fairly judgmental about which sources are good, but okay, so there might be some value in what this writer's saying, but perhaps I ought to look at some other sources just to see if there is some truth or some evidence to support what they're saying. So it's that kind of skepticism, but it's a bit judgmental, but it's critical judgmental. Need to have an opinion. So again, if you've got 10 different writers coming from a particular point of view, and you've reviewed it very well, you looked at the research, that will give you an opinion. Ultimately, you'll start to draw some conclusions about what you're looking at. So you should have an opinion. Opinionated tends to be overbearing on an opinion. That's the only way to do it, but I think opinions are important. Careful evaluation of published work. So so again, this is just part of the research process of looking through what evidence and what's been published in the field, and carefully going through articles and other sources, just trying to build up that fair picture. So being fair, assessing fairly the strengths and weaknesses of people's ideas, and writing without prejudice. So you're trying to be a very objective writer and trying to present things based on the evidence in front of you and what you've looked at, rather than being judgmental too much, or being too opinionated, or being cynicism, or just arrogance to it. So you're trying to be fair to the argument that you're looking at. So making judgments on the basis of a reasonable thought and all the available evidence. So not making assertions without any reason, really. So again, that's part and parcel of the evidence-based research process we go through. So you're looking at various articles and looking them up and summing up together, trying to build a picture based on multiple sources and of good quality, in order that you can make a judgment based, with the thought and carefulness that you've kind of put into it and the available evidence that you've collected, rather than just simply saying, I read this one thing and now I think this, which isn't very research. It's just, I've just read one thing and I've now got that opinion, or I've made this judgment based on one article I've read. That's not very good research approach. So try to get into the habit of writing critically by making sure that you read critically and you include critique in your own writing. So I think we talked a bit in one of the earlier presentations about active reading and being critical about what you read, and I think the criticality does begin there. So if you're able to read critically, you will then naturally write critically, because if you're reading critically, you're not really trusting the source that you're reading. You're not taking it on face value. You're trying to think about and put thought into it when you're reading it, and naturally you'll want to kind of use other sources to see if what you read in that one was actually true or not, or whether there's any
standing purpose to it, or you feel that it's relevant to what you're looking at. So I think naturally, if you're a critical reader, then you're probably going to find that you're then a critical writer as well. Critiquing your own writing is really important. Think about how you're presenting these sources you're finding and the arguments you're making. Is that fair? Is that right? Is that the best way to present it? Is that the logical way to present it? Am I being too forceful on a particular area, or without evidence, or should I put in more? You have to be critical and reflective about your own approach, and that's really hard at the start when you first start writing in this sort of academic way. And it's useful to get other people to read it, and especially tutors to come back, send us things and we'll have a look at them, and we can give you some of that critique from our side. But eventually, critiquing your own work is really important as well, questioning what you do. So just be questioning about whether you're taking the best approach and writing in the right way. Stringing together quotes. So it can be tempting to string together quotes to support an argument, feeling that the more quotes you include, the stronger your actual argument. But it's important to remember that you also need to interpret the quotes to the reader and explain their relevance, discuss their validity, and show how they relate to other evidence you've collected. Yeah, so it's not just a question of, I've quoted 6 times, 6 different authors on the same thing. So if you just sort of strung 6 quotes together, you might think, oh, that's great because I've used 6 different sources. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be using multiple sources, and I've just done 6 different quotes. If you haven't built an argument, if you haven't actually interpreted what these quotes say or what these authors are writing, you haven't put that kind of together, you're still not being critical. Okay, so critical writing isn't just about, there's an emphasis on having multiple sources, as I've been saying, but it's about having multiple sources and interpreting what they're saying, explaining the relevance of what they're saying, discussing the validity of what they're presenting in that evidence in a way that actually builds that argument and presents it. Yes, you'll be citing multiple sources, but it's not just sort of stringing quotes from those multiple sources together to make a point. You don't really make a point that way. We don't really support a proper argument, or you don't make give strength to an argument just by whacking a few direct quotes together from multiple sources. So don't beware of that. I think that can be a little bit of a temptation when you first start out. So the strategic use of paragraphs. So there are several ways in which you can use a paragraph to essentially enhance your critical writing. So you can use paragraphs to make a clear and visual separation between descriptive writing and critical analysis, which is by switching to a new paragraph when you move from description to critical writing and vice versa. So that can be quite helpful. So you can lead in with a descriptive paragraph and then switch to a critical writing paragraph and then script back to description. So that can really help to emphasize to the reader that you're including both description and critical analysis by providing a visual kind of representation of their separation, and pushing you to produce the necessary critical writing, especially if you find that your description paragraphs are always much longer or frequent than your critical analysis paragraphs. So so think about how you structure your paragraphs, how you're going to use paragraphs to kind of make a separation between when you're describing something and when you are being critical about something. So just keep them separated rather than trying to perhaps merge them together. So you're trying to be critical and then you're trying to be descriptive in the same paragraph. I think that would be that makes it quite confusing, and it doesn't necessarily hold up well in terms of structuring and using your paragraph structures a little bit more strategically. So a paragraph break can provide a brief pause for your readers within a longer argument, giving them the opportunity to make sure they're keeping up with your reasoning. So paragraphs that are overly long can require readers to hold too much in their head at once, resulting in their having to reread the material that they can identify, so they can identify the point you're actually making. So if you've got paragraphs which go on and on and on for a long time in terms of critical writing, that can be quite, you're building up this argument from the sources you read, and it's hard to kind of keep that together in the reader's mind while they're reading that whole paragraph. So just try to be reasonable on the paragraph size. So you can use paragraphs to push yourself to include critical writing and also descriptive writing for referencing, by considering each paragraph almost as a kind of essay in miniature, if you like. So you've got your sort of beginning, middle, and your end in terms of the paragraph. So essentially the paragraph tries to introduce the point you make the point with the supporting evidence, that's the real criticality, and then reflect on the point that you've made, and then move on. So it's also worth telling us why you've made that, why you're making that point. So that's part of the introduction to it. So introduction to the point you want to make, and then making the point, and then telling us, why that point's there, reflecting critically upon it. So a certain amount of descriptive writing, as I said, is kind of essential. That's particularly at the start of a section, because if you're coming into the section like the introduction or the discussion section or conclusions, you need a certain amount of description there just to start that section off and explain what that section is going to be about and what you're going to do. So that has to be descriptive. So, but beyond that, there is a danger that too much descriptive writing, like I said, will use up valuable words. From your word limit, reduce the space you have for the critical side where you get the actual best marks. So a useful habit to get into it is make sure if you describe some evidence relevant to your argument, you need to then explain to the reader why that is relevant. So the logic of your explanation contributes to the critical component of your writing. So this is why I am making this point now. Yep. So you always need to explain why you're doing what you're doing in the writing to make sure that point is clearly referenced and relevant to your discussion. So a sentence or two might describe the reference and the evidence, but not enough in itself. The next few sentences need to explain what this evidence contributes to the argument you're actually making. So this is why I'm making the argument, and this is what it contributes. So this may feel like essentially a duplication at first, or that you're explaining something that is obvious, but it is your responsibility to ensure that the relevance of the evidence is explained to the reader. You should not simply assume that the reader will be following the same logic as you, or will just work out the relevance of the quote or data you've kind of described. So what I'm really getting at here is, sometimes students they just present a quote, or they just present a description of some data that they've looked at, and they just go, there it is, boom. What do you think of that? From a reader's perspective, readers, are guided by what they're reading. So it's up to you to really say why I'm showing you this, and this is what I think it means. Okay, so it's really, really important to not only do the argument bit. This all says this all says that. Boom. What do you think? It's like you're supposed to tell me what you think. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you getting from this. Why are you including this? What's your relevance to this argument you're developing? Why have you looked at these 6 different sources and come up with these conclusions? It's really important the why here, why you're doing it, what you're trying to get from it, the argument you're trying to make. Don't just rely on the evidence or even the strength of your argument of the evidence. Be upfront and describe, what actually is, explain what the evidence is and how it contributes to the argument you're actually making. So where did this evidence come from? Why are you making this argument in the first place? So the line of argument then, so the other key element in critical writing is the overall structure of your piece of writing. So writing structure is, again, paramount, especially in reports. So for maximum effectiveness, your writing needs to have a line or lines of argument running through it from the introduction all the way to the conclusion. So just as you use paragraphs on a micro scale to present your critical writing, you also need to consider the ordering of those paragraphs within the overall structure. Yeah, so you can get quite bogged down in the nitty-gritty of individual paragraphs or within a section, but you have to think about the whole report as a whole. So you have to think about the arguments you've been making as you've been presenting them from the point of the introduction all the way down to the conclusion. So, with the bulk of it being in the discussion section, but it must make sense logically as you've worked your way through the whole piece. So I've talked about paragraphs making sense and being like mini essays with an introduction, just argument, and then conclusions. But you also need to think obviously about the whole piece being introduction, discussion, arguments, and conclusions. So it must make sense of the whole thing. So the aim is to lead your readers carefully through the thread of your argument to hopefully a well-supported conclusion at the end. So critical to this is kind of reviewing your writing. So making a review of your writing, you need to, the kinds of questions you might be asking, useful to ask at this stage are, what's the balance between descriptive and critical writing? So while a certain amount of description is, as we said, is necessary to set the context to your analysis and bring the reader in, that the main characteristic of academic writing should be the more critical element. So a useful way to check the balance in your writing is to use two coloured pens and to essentially mark in the margin whether the lines are descriptive or critical. Now, I've said pens, this is assuming like hard copy, but you could do this in Word or any, most word processing type software allows for highlighting. There's a highlighter in Word and you can highlight different parts of your text in different colours. It's just useful to go through and just think, well, what am I describing something here, or am I being critical about it? Am I building an argument? So do that. So again, if you've got lots of description, you've got very little critical writing, then clearly this report isn't going to be big on critical analysis. So it's not going to be in those higher marks bands. Okay, so you can kind of get a sense of the balance of it by that. So obviously it changes at different points. So at the beginning of, like I said, at the beginning and end of sort of sections, then obviously it's going to be more descriptive because you have to lead a reader into the section and you have to back a reader kind of out of a section and lead into the next. So there's going to be certain points like that where it's going to be more description. That's fine. But in the body of those sections should be more critical writing than descriptive writing. So it will change, but you should be able to represent that with your highlighting and see exactly where the critical is and where the descriptive is. So you also need to remember, why should the reader be convinced by what you've actually just written? So remember that just as you are asking, why should I believe what I've just read? That's the critical reading approach. Readers of your work will be asking the same question of your writing. So I'll be there going, why should I believe you? Why is your argument here? Why are your conclusions the right ones? What they backed up on? Where's your evidence? What have you actually done to kind of build that argument and prove it? So a critical read for your own writing should reveal some of the gaps in the logic that you've put together, and hopefully you can rectify those before you submit them for our critique or for marking. Yeah. So the idea of reviewing. So this again comes back to a lot of this stuff, I'm talking about now, reviewing your work, writing, for example. That's going to take time. Highlighting out the descriptive parts and the critical writing parts, and then reflecting on those and trying to, ask this argument of why should I believe what I've written, and then finding more evidence. And, you're going to bring up, if you're critical about your own review of your own work, then you're going to bring up issues and aspects of it that you're going to need fixing and repairing and working on and redrafting, and that all takes time, which is why I've said, this review part is really, really important. You've got to give yourself time to do that. This is why you need to use the full length of the time that you have for the deadline, not just, start something really late, because then you just don't get that time to review it, don't get the time to critically analyze it, you don't get the time to redraft it or repair it, and often, that will lead to a poor marks. So the other thing is to say, is my conclusion trailed and supported sufficiently well by my preceding analysis and the arguments I've actually made? So check out the conclusions that you've drawn, then locate and check the supporting evidence that you provided. Really a good way of making sure you haven't forgotten to include a crucial piece of evidence. So if you've got a conclusion and you think, that's a really good conclusion, but I can't actually find where I put the supporting evidence for that, then it's like, I've forgotten to put in the evidence that supports that conclusion. Or sometimes, I've come across students where they've got a load of evidence and then they don't actually make the conclusion. It's like, you've presented loads of information to me, which sounds like it could be a logical argument, but there's no punchline, there's no conclusion at the end. So, either way, again, reviewing your work, looking for it in a critical way, thinking about, does this make a conclusion, or is there a conclusion there? What evidence backs it up? Again, it will hopefully prompt you to really trying to think about what you're writing and where you're going, and if you've missed something out. There's also a way of checking that when your reader comes to the end of your writing, the conclusions make sense rather than being a surprise or unconvincing leap of logic. Okay, so obviously the whole point of the joining up of your logic is that you go through an evidence trail, you go through sources and arguments that you've made, and at the end you can draw some conclusions for the whole piece which makes sense on the basis of what you've just read in terms of those arguments. If you read a whole load of arguments about various different points and about the topic area, and then suddenly at the end there's this conclusion which doesn't seem to be really relevant to what you've just read in terms of the the argument, then clearly that's wrong. There's something gone wrong there. So you need to address that. And again, you'll pick that up if you're reviewing in a good way. Including sort of any unsubstantiated statements. So you make a statement, this is what I believe about this, and then there was no evidence or any argument around what you've just said. You've just gone, it's this, boom. And it's like, well, okay, but have you got any sources for that? Are you backing that up? I can't see any argument. And, it's a real in terms of the marking. Unsubstantiated statements are not good. So sometimes a generalized sweeping statement can slip through. It's the kind of statement that might be acceptable in conversation, but it's not an academic approach. It's not in academic writing. So sometimes you think, oh, this is so obvious, everyone knows this, I'll put that down. And actually, everyone down the pub knows that, maybe, depending on which pub you're drinking, if you're drinking a pub at all, or with friends or family. Friends and family know this. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a good academic argument or appropriate for academic writing. You need to back up everything you say with sources. So no unsubstantiated statements, really. Even if you think that's a statement that everyone knows. Well, if everyone knows it, there should be lots of articles and papers and text to kind of backs that up, so you can put in some sources that reference it. So three main ways of dealing with these sort of statements. Either present the evidence to support the statement, like I said, find some sources that back it up and put them in, or you could rephrase the statement to sound more cautious. So you could say, so often academics say things like, it could be argued that, or this suggests that. And when academics do it, they do it all the time, by the way. It's not a hidden thing. You read a lot of academic papers, you'll find a lot of it could be argued or this might suggest, and it's really just academics just sort of saying, I'm pretty sure this is a kind of general statement everyone accepts, but I'm not going to say that because that would be a unsubstantiated statement, which I don't want to include and would be bad. So at the same time, I don't necessarily have to back up everything with loads of evidence. So I'll just be a bit cautious and say it could be argued or this suggests. So that's a kind of a weasel words that kind of make it acceptable to make a statement, but it only makes it acceptable to make a statement that essentially no one's really going to argue with. So be cautious on general statements that you perhaps aren't going to be argued with. But if you've got something where you think, well, somebody could argue that, or maybe I'm a bit more uncertain, then present the evidence to support it. Or if you've got unsubstantiated statement and you think, yeah, actually, I'll remove the statement, and do something else. It's the final option of the three things that you can deal with it. So I personally, the first one though, building evidence is really important. So show me the evidence for that. That ends any discussion about it, really. You've got evidence that backs that up. I'm just going to go, yeah, okay, you've got your evidence there. I see it. Great. Move on. So hopefully that was quite a whistle stop view of critical writing and descriptive writing. Hopefully you understand some of the difference between it. I think with critical writing, practice makes perfect in everything, and you have to put practice into it. That's why we get you to do this type of report writing and research writing, writing in a research way, because we want you to practice those sort of good skills in writing, which hopefully will develop your critical writing approach. So I think the important thing is to draw from this. Obviously, go back through this presentation if you're still a bit mystified as to what I've said. Just go back through it, look at the presentation in detail. I've tried to keep my words, as you know, on these slides so that they're there so you can review them. But the key is, evidence-based. You're looking for evidence to support your writing, thinking about what you're writing. I think that's a core thing about critical writing. It's not just writing, it's thinking about why you're writing something and the purpose of it and what you're trying to achieve and the argument you're trying to make and the conclusions you're trying to draw. There's no trick to it really apart from that. I think about what I write. And again, if you're academic, you're kind of used to doing this approach, I suppose. Becomes embedded within us that we should, be critical about what we're writing and thinking about the argument and building the argument and developing our points and making sound conclusions at the end and not making unsubstantiated statements. We're just backing everything up with support and so on. So that's what we're trying to get you to do with critical writing. But I appreciate when you start out, it's it's quite an ask. But the thing is, you may never have thought about writing in that way. You may never have thought about backing something up with a source, or using an argument, or developing different approaches and bringing in different perspectives and arguing on the page, or developing discussion in that way. But that's something that we really do want you to think about and do, and it will make you so much of a better student, a better academic student, and a better academic eventually, in terms of how you develop your own writing, your own style, which will help you later on, obviously, in loads of professional life as well. So don't forget, these skills are core to professional practice, because people in a professional world just write better. If they have a more critical approach, it actually becomes much better writing. If you're writing for customers, or you're writing to a manager, or writing to a boss, you're writing to somebody important in the organization, then being able to build a critical argument, build your own thoughts, add conclusions that are substantiated by evidence and backed up by reasoned argument and logical structure, boy, you've got a powerful writing style there, and you can persuade people and make things happen for you. And get your argument across, get your point across, which may mean that you move up in organizations. So this isn't just academic writing. Academic writing gives you power. It gives you professional power that you can then use to give you greater employment opportunities in the future. So that's again part and parcel of why you're studying, I suppose. Okay, so thank you very much. Best of luck.